All right, let's dive into Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. It's a big one covering, well, basically all of human history.
It really is ambitious, but Harari manages to make it so engaging. And you wanted to get into some specific stuff, right?
Exactly. We'll be breaking down those 6 key themes you all picked out.
Perfect. Those were the 3 major revolutions, the impact of collective fictions,
How economic and power systems develop,
the philosophical and ethical questions Harari brings up.
what it all means for our future, and of course...
What makes Harari such a captivating writer?
So to kick things off, let's talk about the 3 revolutions that really changed the game for humanity.
The cognitive, agricultural, and scientific revolutions. Big turning points.
Let's start with the cognitive revolution. Harari says it happened between 70,000 and 30,000 years ago. What went down? What was so revolutionary about it?
That's when Homo sapiens started thinking and communicating in completely new ways. Like, we're talking about the emergence of language.
Yeah, so not just describing the world around them, but
also creating stories, myths, ideas, things that don't actually physically exist.
okay, so this is where those collective fictions come in. We'll definitely have to unpack that later. But first, I'm just curious, if we could go back in time and meet these early sapiens, could we actually have a conversation with them?
Harari suggests that we probably could.
Wow.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
I mean, we tend to think of our ancestors as, primitive cavemen.
Right. But you've got discoveries like that Statel Lion Man figurine, a sculpture from over 30,000 years ago.
Right.
It hints that they were already capable of abstract thought. They had complex inner lives, beliefs. They had a way of understanding the world that we might be able to tap into.
It definitely changes my perspective.
Okay.
Let's fast forward a bit to the agricultural revolution. Now, this one Harari calls history's biggest fraud.
Yeah.
I'm definitely intrigued by that.
Right, because we usually think about agriculture as this huge step forward.
Yeah, like the basis of civilization as we know it.
But Harari's point is that for individual humans, the shift from foraging to farming wasn't necessarily a good deal.
So trading the hunter-gatherer lifestyle for, longer hours, a less diverse diet, vulnerability to famine, disease.
Exactly. If you think about it, hunter-gatherers actually had to work fewer hours to get food. They had more variety in their diet. And they were less likely to be wiped out by, a single bad harvest or an epidemic.
Yeah, it's true.
Of course, agriculture had its benefits. Settled life, food surpluses, which allowed for bigger, more complex societies. But there were definite downsides.
Big time. I mean, it makes you wonder why humans made the switch in the first place, right?
Right. And there are a bunch of theories about that, actually. One really fascinating idea that Harari talks about is that monumental architecture, like Göbekli Tepe, may have actually driven the shift to agriculture.
Whoa, really?
Yeah. Just imagine the sheer amount of labor needed to build those structures.
Yeah.
You'd need a consistent and reliable food source to feed all those workers.
So instead of agriculture leading to settlements, maybe the desire to build these incredible structures pushed people into farming.
Exactly. It's one of those arguments that completely flips how we normally think about things.
Totally. Okay, so we've gone from the cognitive revolution to the agricultural revolution. Let's make one last jump forward to the scientific revolution, which I guess takes off around the 1500s.
Yeah, about then. And this one's all about reason, observation, and experimentation.
Okay, so humans are starting to believe they can actually discover new knowledge and use it to, control or shape the world around them?
That's it. This move from relying on traditional beliefs or religious dogma to looking for evidence-based knowledge, huge.
Absolutely.
But it's important to remember that the scientific revolution wasn't just about, telescopes and test tubes.
I mean, you're right. Think about all those voyages of exploration.
Exactly.
Like Columbus's journey to the Americas. They were fueled by scientific curiosity, sure, but also by this desire to conquer and exploit new lands.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The thirst for knowledge went hand in hand with the drive for power, And from that explosive mix, you get the Industrial Revolution.
And the modern world with all its complexities and, contradictions. It really makes you think.
Oh, sure.
So can we finally unpack these collective fictions Harari keeps bringing up?
Let's do it.
Because honestly, that's one of the most mind-blowing parts of the book.
Yeah, definitely key to understanding how we got to where we are. Harari argues that large-scale human cooperation, like empires or corporations, is actually built on these shared myths and beliefs and stories.
So things that only exist in our collective imagination.
Pretty much.
Okay, give me some examples. I'm trying to really grasp this.
Okay, think about money.
Okay.
It's essentially just pieces of paper or, these days, digital entries.
Right.
But they have value only because we all agree they do.
Right.
Or nations. Imagine these communities that inspire such strong patriotism and loyalty.
Yeah.
They're really just lines drawn on a map, right?
It's crazy, right? How these things we can't see or touch have so much power over us.
Yeah, it really is. And it raises all these interesting questions. Like Harari points out that the fate of actual real entities like ecosystems or endangered species
Yeah.
often depend on the whims of these imagined entities like corporations or nations.
So, like, the fate of a rainforest could hinge on the decisions of a company that only exists on paper. That's wild.
Yeah, it highlights how these collective fictions have become the dominant force shaping our world. They might not be real in a tangible sense, but their impact is undeniable.
Okay, now I'm starting to see how these collective fictions are behind everything, from our economic systems to our social hierarchies. But can we get into how these systems actually formed? Like, where did it all begin?
For sure. Let's start with money, why don't we?
Yeah, because it's such a huge part of our lives.
Yeah.
And yet we rarely stop and think about where it came from.
I know, right? So Harari traces the evolution of money, from those early barter systems where people just exchanged goods directly, all the way to, the crazily complex global financial networks we have today.
I bet there were some interesting stops along the way. Like, did we always use coins and paper bills?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, cowrie shells, for example, were used as currency for thousands of years in different parts of the world. And there are these crazy examples of cigarettes becoming a form of money in prisons or POW camps.
That's fascinating. I guess it shows how money is really just about trust, right?
Yeah.
Believing that something has value, even if it's not inherently valuable on its own.
Exactly. And that trust has just become more and more institutionalized over time. Think about the gold standard.
Right.
That tied the value of money to a physical amount of gold.
Right. It's like you need something tangible to back up this abstract concept.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with strangers or trading across long distances.
Exactly. And of course, money has facilitated trade and cooperation and economic growth. But let's be real, it's also created massive inequality and fueled so many conflicts.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
A total double-edged sword. Speaking of conflicts, I'm curious about empires. Where do they fit into all of this?
Empires, well, they've been a major force throughout history.
For sure.
But how they've used those collective fictions to build and maintain their power is interesting.
Yeah. How did they pull that off?
Well, a lot of times they rely on these ideologies of universalism. They claim they're bringing order or justice or civilization to the world.
Right.
They create these big narratives that make their dominance seem, natural and beneficial, even if they're built on brutal conquest.
It's like telling a story that convinces both the conquerors and the conquered to just go along with the system, even if it's totally unfair.
Exactly. Think of the Roman Empire, for example. They use this idea of Roman law and civilization to justify their expansion. Or the British Empire with the whole white man's burden concept to explain their colonial rule.
Yet these narratives can be so convincing, even when they're based on messed up logic. I guess it's a good reminder to always be critical of the stories we're told, especially from people in power.
Always. So along with money and empires, you've got this other powerful force shaping human societies.
Yeah.
Social hierarchies.
Right.
And Harari argues that a lot of these hierarchies are based on what he calls imagined orders, not biological realities.
Imagined orders. Okay, I'm all ears. What does that mean exactly?
Basically, he's saying that these hierarchies are based on, arbitrary distinctions, things like race or caste or gender, rather than any actual inherent differences between people.
So you're saying something like the caste system in India, where people are born into a rigid social hierarchy based on ideas of purity, that's just an arbitrary system?
Yeah, I mean, there's no scientific basis for these divisions. They're purely social constructs, but they have a huge impact on people's lives.
It's a powerful example of how beliefs, even totally baseless ones, can create systems that keep inequality and injustice going.
And it's not just the caste system. You've got the Jim Crow laws in the U.S.
Right.
Designed to keep racial segregation after slavery was abolished.
Right.
Or the historical oppression of women, justified by, everything from religious texts to pseudoscientific claims about, female inferiority.
It's really crazy how these imagined orders even when they're obviously unjust and harmful, stick around for so long. It's like they get woven into the fabric of society and become these unchangeable facts.
Yeah, they become real because people believe in them and act accordingly. But the key takeaway is that these hierarchies are human creations, not laws of nature.
Right, which means we can change them. But before we jump into that, I'd love to hear more about how all this impacts our search for meaning and happiness.
Perfect. That's a great lead into the more philosophical and ethical side of Sapiens. So, we've talked about how these big revolutions and these collective fictions have shaped humanity's journey. But I'm curious, are we, as sapiens in the 21st century, any happier than our hunter-gatherer ancestors?
That's the big question, isn't it? We have all this technology and comfort, but are we actually better off? What does Harari say?
Well, he brings up both sides of the argument. He acknowledges that romantic view that sees modern life as, a source of alienation and unhappiness.
Right.
But he also acknowledges the more optimistic view, the one that points to the progress we've made in things like health and lifespan and the reduction in violence.
I can see both sides. On one hand, we have way more opportunities and conveniences than ever before.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's so much information overload and pressure and anxieties that our ancestors never had to deal with.
Exactly. And that's where Harari reminds us that happiness isn't just about, objective conditions like wealth or health. It's also about our subjective expectations, how we see our own lives.
So even if we have more stuff than our ancestors, if our expectations have also gone up, we might not actually be happier.
Right. It's like that hedonic treadmill, always running just to stay in place. Harari introduces this idea of a happiness baseline. It's influenced by both our biochemistry and our social and cultural environment.
So we have a kind of set point for happiness.
Yeah.
Partly determined by our genes, but also shaped by our upbringing and experiences.
Exactly. So it's not just about reaching some external goal or getting more stuff. It's about understanding how we're wired and how that interacts with the world around us.
So are you saying there's a limit to how happy we can be?
It's a question Harari definitely brings up. Think of it like a thermostat. We can adjust the temperature within a certain range, but we can't just completely override the system.
I like that analogy. Makes me wonder what those limits are, and how we can work within them to actually be happier.
It's a journey, that's for sure. Okay, let's shift gears for a sec. I want to talk about another fundamental question that, humans have been wrestling with forever.
Yeah.
The meaning of life.
Oh, yeah, the big one.
Yeah.
How do we find purpose when, ultimately everything ends?
Right. Harari takes us through history, looking at how different cultures and beliefs have tried to answer that question. He talks about the ancient Sumerian myth of Gilgamesh, searching for immortality, but ultimately learning to accept death.
Right.
And he contrasts that with the modern scientific view that sees death as, this technical problem we might be able to solve.
So going from embracing our mortality to trying to conquer it through technology, it's like we can't escape that tension.
No, we can't. What's interesting is that modern ideologies like liberalism, socialism, feminism, they often focus on improving life in the present rather than focusing on an afterlife.
So a shift from transcendence to making the most of our time here and now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about building a good society for ourselves and future generations rather than pinning our hopes on some other world. Speaking of good societies, all this talk about meaning and purpose brings us to ethics and morality.
Right. In a world that's, getting more complex and technologically advanced all the time, how do we even figure out what's right and wrong? Has it changed over time?
Oh, totally. Harari argues that the scientific revolution and the rise of humanism basically shifted moral authority from, divine revelation to human reason and experience.
So we're not looking to religious texts or commandments to tell us how to behave.
Not as much, no. We're relying more on our own judgment, our empathy to figure things out. But this shift doesn't make things easier, that's for sure.
Oh, so?
Well, Harari talks about this tension between individual happiness and, the well-being of the whole group.
Right.
He wants us to think about how our actions impact not just ourselves, but the people around us and the planet as a whole.
That's definitely where things get complicated. We see this tension everywhere, like with economic inequality or environmental sustainability or the ethics of new technologies. Something that might feel good for one person in the short term could have terrible consequences down the line.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a really important point. What all this means for the future. I mean, Harari doesn't sugarcoat things. He's not afraid to look at the potential downsides of human progress, especially with the challenges we face today.
Climate change, AI, gene editing, all this stuff. has so much potential, but also some serious risks. So how do we navigate all that?
Well, he stresses how important it is to understand those collective fictions we've been talking about, to recognize how powerful they are, for good or bad. Because they've shaped our past, and they'll keep shaping our future, whether we're aware of them or not.
So we need to be more mindful of the stories we're telling ourselves, the ones that are guiding our actions. What else does Harari suggest?
He emphasizes that the scientific revolution is still happening, which is, exciting, but it also brings huge risks. Because now we're not just shaping the world around us, we're starting to shape our own biology and even our consciousness with things like genetic engineering and AI.
It's both exciting and terrifying at the same time. It's like we're on the edge of a whole new era of human evolution, but we have no idea where it's going to lead.
Exactly. And Harari doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He just lays out the challenges and encourages us to think critically, question our assumptions, really consider the long-term consequences of our actions.
So it's a call to action, a reminder that we're not just along for the ride. We can actually shape the future, but we got to do it consciously and responsibly.
Right. And it's not just about individual responsibility either. He talks about how important global cooperation is for dealing with big problems like climate change, nuclear weapons, the ethical questions about these new technologies.
Like we're all in this together, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
What we do affects everyone.
Totally. Okay, last thing I want to touch on is Yuval Noah Harari's writing style, because it's part of what makes Sapiens such an interesting and thought-provoking read.
He's so good at weaving together history and science and philosophy, even a bit of humor sometimes.
Yeah.
And he does it in a way that's like accessible, but still intellectually engaging. He's a great storyteller.
I agree. He manages to make complex ideas clear without dumbing them down. And he's not afraid to challenge our assumptions, make us question everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our place in the world.
He's also really good at asking those big, tough questions we usually avoid.
Totally.
The meaning of life, what is happiness, how should we live, those kinds of things.
It's like he's forcing us to confront them head on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he does it with this sense of wonder, which I think is kind of contagious. It makes you want to keep learning, keep digging deeper.
For sure.
And Sapiens is just the first book in his trilogy, right?
It is. He goes on to talk about the future of humanity in Homo Deus, and then offers some, advice for navigating the 21st century in 21 lessons for the 21st century.
Well, those are going on my reading list.
Definitely worth checking out.
Yeah, it's a question that really makes you think after everything we've been talking about. All the stories we told ourselves, the good and the bad ones. So where do we go from here? What kind of future are we trying to build, and what stories will get us there?
That's the challenge, right? We're at this crazy point in history with all this technology and the world being so interconnected, but it's also a time of huge uncertainty and risk. The stories we choose to buy into right now, they'll have a massive impact on where we go as a species.
You were saying earlier that Harari highlights how important it is to be aware of those collective fictions. Can you talk about that a bit more? Like, how do we even begin to, untangle those stories that have been part of our societies for so long?
It starts with thinking critically. Harari encourages us to question everything, to challenge those assumptions we've just inherited, and to look for different perspectives. A lot of the systems and structures we just take for granted, from economics to social hierarchies,
Right.
They're based on ideas that people made up, not some law of nature.
So we need to kind of deconstruct these narratives that we've been told are truth and ask ourselves, who benefits from these stories? What are the power dynamics? Are these really the stories we want to keep living by?
Exactly. It's about taking control, being the storytellers. Think about the whole idea of progress, for example. For a long time, we've been told that technological advancement and economic growth are the most important things, the measures of success.
It's a story that's led to some amazing innovations for sure. But as we said, it's also come at a cost. The environment, inequality, this drive to consume more and more, which just doesn't feel sustainable.
Yeah. So maybe it's time to rewrite that story of progress, What if instead of just focusing on material wealth and how powerful our tech is, we prioritize things like well-being, sustainability, social justice?
What if success was measured by, happiness or equality or how healthy our planet is?
Exactly. Imagine what kind of world we could build if those were our values.
It's an awesome vision. But how do we actually get there? It's one thing to talk about changing the story, but the systems that keep those harmful stories going are really powerful.
You're not wrong. It's not going to be easy, but Harari does offer some hope. He says it begins with individual awareness and action. Each of us can challenge those dominant narratives and promote different ones.
So being mindful of what we buy, being responsible citizens, getting involved in our communities, supporting businesses and organizations that share our values, holding people in power accountable.
That's it. And also remembering that we're not alone in this. There are so many people and organizations around the world already working towards a better future, a more just and sustainable one. Connecting with them, helping them out, amplifying their voices, that can contribute to a real shift in how we think.
Yeah, it's about remembering we're all connected. What we do has a ripple effect. And in the end, it's about realizing that we can shape the future, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us.
That's the amazing and kind of scary thing about being sapiens in the 21st century. We have so much knowledge and power, but we also face these incredible challenges. The choices we make now will affect humanity for a very long time.
It's humbling and exciting at the same time. Like, we're not just along for the ride. We can actually write the story.
And that might be the most important takeaway from Sapiens. It's a call to action, to imagine and create a future that we can be proud of, a future where humans and nature can both thrive.
I love that. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Sapiens.
A brief history of humankind. We've covered a lot of ground, thousands of years of history.
We've looked at how human thought and behavior have evolved and talked about some of the biggest questions there are.
I hope it sparked some new ideas for you listening out there. Go check out Harari's book, look into the stuff we've discussed, and keep questioning, keep learning, and keep imagining what kind of world you want to live in.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this epic journey through human history. Until next time, keep on diving deep.